I didn't fake the doctor's appointment because I was scared of dying. I did it because I was scared of living one more day without knowing the truth. For weeks, something about my own son felt off. Not loud, not cruel, just wrong in the quiet ways that only a parent notices. The way he answered questions too quickly. The way his wife watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. The way conversations stopped the moment I entered the room. So I told them the cardiologist wanted more tests. I said it might take a few days. I packed a small bag, hugged my son, and watched relief flicker across his face before he hid it. That was the moment I knew I was right. I didn't go to the hospital. I parked 2 streets away and waited. From a distance, I watched my own house like a stranger would. Lights turning on, doors opening, people moving with a confidence they never had when I was home. I told myself I was being paranoid. I almost left. Then a woman I'd never seen before stepped out of the shadows. She looked at me like she already knew everything. She grabbed my arm, not hard, just enough to stop me from walking away. "You don't recognize me," she said quietly, "but I recognize what's happening to you." I tried to pull back. She didn't let go. "Go home," she whispered. "Watch. Listen. And by tonight, you'll finally understand who you really raised." I laughed it off. I told myself she was just another lonely neighbor. But when night fell, I stayed. I stayed because a father knows when the ground beneath his family is about to collapse. I stayed because some truths only show themselves in the dark. And when I finally heard what my own son said about me behind closed doors, my legs gave out, not because of my heart, but because in that moment, everything I believed about family shattered at once. The first time the feeling came over me, nothing in the house had actually changed. The morning light still crept through the kitchen window the same way it always had, soft and pale, catching the dust in the air. The coffee maker hummed steady and familiar. The floorboards did not creak any louder than usual. And yet something inside my chest tightened, slow and deliberate, like a hand closing around a truth I was not ready to hold. I had spent most of my life walking into rooms where people lied for a living. Courtrooms, interrogation rooms, conference rooms with polished tables and rehearsed smiles. I knew what danger felt like when it sat across from me. I never imagined I would feel it sitting alone at my own kitchen table. That was when I understood something was wrong. Not outside the house, not in the neighborhood, inside, already living with me. I was 69 years old, then retired, widowed, and stubbornly attached to routine. I woke early because my body had learned to do so after decades of federal service. I made my coffee the same way every morning, black, no sugar. I read the local paper, even though most days it only confirmed what I already knew about the world. Crime did not disappear with age. It just learned new disguises. After my wife passed, the house became too quiet. Silence has weight when you have lived with another person for most of your life. It settles into corners, into hallways, into the spaces where voices used to be. When Mark called and said he and Linda were struggling again, I did not hesitate. Family does that to you. It bypasses logic and goes straight for obligation. They moved in 3 months after the funeral. Mark was my only child. I raised him to believe that work mattered, that honesty mattered, that you owned the consequences of your decisions. When his business collapsed and the debt followed him like a shadow, I stepped in. I helped him negotiate with creditors. I covered what I could. I told myself this was what fathers did when the world knocked their children down. Linda arrived with him carrying neat boxes and careful manners. She smiled easily. She thanked me often. She kept the house clean in a way that felt performative, as if someone might be grading her. At first, I appreciated it. After a while, I noticed how closely she watched me when she thought I was not looking. In the beginning, nothing felt threatening. Mark cooked dinner a few nights a week. Linda insisted on organizing my medications, even though I had been managing them just fine for years. When she asked about my doctor appointments, I told myself she was being considerate. When she asked again the following week, and then again 2 days later, I told myself I was being sensitive. Grief makes you second-guess your instincts. The first real warning came disguised as nothing at all. An envelope from my insurance provider lay open on the counter one afternoon when I came back from the grocery store. The paper inside had been folded and unfolded not carelessly, but deliberately. When I asked about it, Linda answered before Mark could speak. She said it must have arrived earlier, and she thought it was junk. Her voice was smooth, practiced, almost rehearsed. Mark nodded and said nothing. That silence stayed with me. A few days later, I found printed pages on the home computer, mortgage terminology, insurance language, words that did not belong to casual browsing. When I asked, Linda laughed lightly and said Mark had been helping a friend understand a loan. Mark stood behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. I had spent decades listening to people explain away evidence. Innocent people answer questions. Guilty people perform answers. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, counting the slow rotations, replaying conversations in my head. Linda's questions about my memory, Mark's sudden interest in how long I planned to stay in the house, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I was distracted. When two people share a lie, it stops being coincidence. It becomes coordination. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would not confront them. Confrontation ends investigations. I had learned that lesson early in my career. People become careful when they know they are being watched. What I needed was the opposite. I needed them comfortable, confident, certain that I was exactly what they wanted me to be, an old man. I called my primary care physician and scheduled an appointment. I asked the right questions. I framed my concerns the right way. By the time I hung up, I had the outline of a story that would buy me time. Concerns about my heart, some irregular readings, a recommendation for observation in Phoenix. At breakfast, I delivered the news casually. I said the doctor wanted me monitored for a while. Nothing urgent, just precaution. I watched their faces carefully as I stirred my oatmeal. Linda's reaction came first. Her eyes widened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She said she was worried. She said we would pray for good results. Her concern was flawless. Mark's question came a beat later. He asked how long I would be gone. Not how I felt, not whether I was scared. How long? That question settled everything for me. I told them 2 weeks, maybe more. I said Phoenix would be hot but manageable. Linda insisted on helping me pack. Mark offered to drive me to the clinic, but did not insist when I declined. I could feel the tension under their politeness, like wires humming beneath a wall. The motel I chose was less than 10 minutes from my house. It smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The air conditioner rattled like it had a grudge against the desert heat. I paid in cash and checked in under my own name. I was not hiding yet. I was observing. From the parking lot, I could see the roofline of my house in the distance. At night, the lights told a story. Which rooms stayed lit? How late? Who came and went? On the second evening, I drove past slowly. Linda's car was gone. Mark's was still in the driveway. I parked down the block and watched the house from the shadows. It felt surreal, like standing outside my own life. I was adjusting the seat when a voice startled me. She stood on the sidewalk with a grocery bag in one hand and a knowing look in her eyes. Evelyn Brooks. I had seen her around the neighborhood for years, quiet, observant. The kind of woman people underestimate until it is too late. She asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. She did not believe me. She told me she had noticed unusual activity at my house. Late nights, visitors. She told me she used to be an accountant before she retired. She said patterns never stopped speaking to her. Then she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. Tonight, you will know who is really running things in that house. Her words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a conclusion. I asked her what she meant. She shook her head and said some truths had to be heard, not explained. Then she walked away, leaving me alone with the desert air and the weight of her certainty. I returned to the motel and sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, staring at the blank television screen. I had prosecuted organized crime financial fraud men who believed power made them untouchable. None of that prepared me for the possibility that my own son had chosen a different allegiance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned the color of old copper. Night settled in slowly, deliberately. I knew I would not sleep. Some nights are not meant for rest. They are meant for reckoning. When I finally stepped back into my car and drove toward the house, I did not feel fear. I felt clarity, the kind that comes when denial finally loosens its grip. Whatever I was about to learn, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never look at my family the same way again. I noticed the change before I understood it. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no sudden cruelty. It was quieter than that, more careful, the kind of change you only catch if you've lived long enough to know when a room feels different, even though the furniture hasn't moved. Linda started asking about my health more often. At first, I told myself it was normal. I was 69, recently widowed, living with my son and his wife. Concern was expected, even welcome. But concern has a tone to it, and Linda's didn't sound like worry. It sounded like inventory. Did you take your blood pressure medication this morning? Are you still on the statin? Or did the doctor change that? When was your last physical again? She asked the questions lightly always while doing something else. Washing dishes, folding laundry, checking her phone. She never waited for long answers. She just needed confirmation. Mark would usually be nearby when she asked, leaning against a doorway, sitting at the table. He never added much, just nodded, sometimes smiled, always said the same thing if I looked at him too long. Linda just wants to make sure you're okay, Dad. He said it the way you repeat a line you've practiced in your head. I'd spent most of my adult life as a federal prosecutor. I'd listened to people tell the truth badly and lies beautifully. What bothered me wasn't what Linda asked. It was how quickly she moved on once she had the answer she wanted, like she was checking boxes. The first time I noticed something was missing, I thought it was my mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet. Mark was out. Linda was upstairs on a work call. I went to the desk in the den to grab a bank statement. I kept them in a small file drawer. Nothing fancy, just routine paperwork. The drawer slid open easily, but the folder wasn't where it should have been. I stood there longer than I needed to. I knew that drawer. I'd organized it myself after my wife passed. Same order I'd used for years. Utilities, insurance, banking. Nothing complicated. The banking folder was there, but thinner than it should have been. I flipped through it slowly. Statements were missing. Not all of them. Just enough to make me doubt myself. I told myself I'd probably moved them. Grief does strange things to memory. So does age if you listen to enough people tell you it does. I closed the drawer and went back to the kitchen. Linda came downstairs later with a smile that felt too polished for a quiet afternoon. Did you find what you were looking for? Yes, I said. She nodded once and poured herself coffee. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it stayed with me. Over the next week, small things began to shift. Mail was opened before I got to it. Envelopes left neatly stacked on the counter, slit cleanly as if that made it acceptable. When I asked, Linda answered without hesitation. I didn't know if it was urgent. I didn't want it to get lost. Mark backed her up without looking at me. She's just trying to help Dad. I stopped asking after that. Not because I believed them, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't interfere. That was when the paperwork appeared. Linda brought it up casually over dinner. Meatloaf night. My wife's old recipe, the one Linda never quite got right. Too dry, always too dry. I talked to the insurance company today, she said, cutting her food carefully. There are a few forms they recommend updating. Just routine stuff, especially at your age. At your age? I kept chewing. What kind of forms? I asked. She waved her fork slightly. Beneficiaries, medical authorizations, things like that. It's better to be prepared. Courts can be complicated if something happens. I looked at Mark. He stared at his plate. Linda went on smoothly. We can look at them together later. No rush. There was always no rush, which meant the opposite. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay awake, listening to the house settle the quiet clicks and creaks that had once comforted me. I thought about my wife, how she used to insist on double-checking documents, how she trusted me with every decision because she knew I'd protect her. Now I was the one being managed. The moment I knew it wasn't in my head came on a Sunday morning. I'd gone out early to pick up coffee and pastries. When I came back, Linda's car was gone. Mark was in the living room pacing. He stopped when he saw me. You didn't tell us you were going out, he said. I raised an eyebrow. I went to get breakfast. He nodded too quickly. Linda's at an appointment. What kind of appointment? He hesitated. Just errands. Later that afternoon, I found the printer tray warm. Fresh pages sat on top. I didn't need to read them to know what they were. The header was enough. Mortgage documents, my house, my address. I didn't touch them. I didn't confront anyone. I went back to my room and closed the door. That night, I made a decision. I told them I had a cardiology referral in Phoenix, that the doctor wanted to run a series of tests, that it might take a few days, maybe longer. Linda reacted immediately. Too immediately. Phoenix, how long will you be gone? Mark looked up then. I'm not sure, I said. Could be a week. Could be 2. Linda pressed her lips together, nodding like she was calculating something. We'll take care of everything here, she said. You focus on your health. Mark echoed her. Of course. We've got this. I booked a motel 5 miles from my own house. Not a nice one. Nothing memorable. A place where no one asked questions, and no one cared how long you stayed. I packed light, clothes, notebook. Old habits die hard. On the first night, I sat in my car down the street from my own home and watched the lights come on. Linda moved through the house with purpose. Mark followed. They didn't sit down the way they used to. They didn't turn on the TV. The house looked less like a home and more like an office. That was when a woman I'd never seen before knocked on my window. I startled hard enough to hit the steering wheel. She held up her hands calmly and stepped back. Late 60s, neatly dressed, sharp eyes. You're Walter Hayes, she said. I nodded slowly. I live 2 houses down, she said. Evelyn Brooks. I've seen you around for years. I didn't answer. She glanced toward my house, then back at me. I thought you were supposed to be out of town. I hesitated. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. If I were you, I'd stay right where you are tonight. Why she didn't smile? Because by morning, you're going to understand something about your son that you don't want to believe yet. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? She straightened, already stepping away. Watch the house, she said. Really, watch it. Tonight. Then she walked back down the sidewalk, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing. I stayed there until well past midnight, staring at the windows of the place I had once thought was the safest thing I owned. And for the first time in my life, I understood that love could blind a man just as thoroughly as fear. I didn't go back to the motel that night. I stayed parked down the street until the neighborhood went quiet, until porch lights clicked off one by one, and the hum of traffic faded into something distant and harmless. I stayed because Evelyn's words had lodged somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and unresolved, and because the house across the street no longer felt like mine. It felt like a stage set after the audience had left, still lit, still waiting. Just before 1 in the morning, Linda turned off the lights in the den. That was new. Usually that room stayed bright late into the night. Papers, laptops, quiet movement. Tonight, everything went dark at once, like a decision had been made. Mark followed her upstairs a moment later. I saw their shadows on the wall through the front window moving together, then separating. I drove back to the motel after that, my hands steady on the wheel, my thoughts anything but. Sleep didn't come. When it did, it was shallow and full of half-formed dreams that dissolved the moment I opened my eyes. At dawn, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the thin carpet, trying to remember the last time I'd felt this kind of uncertainty. Not fear exactly, something colder. The sense that events were moving whether I participated or not. I showered, dressed, and drove back toward the house just after 8. Mark left at 8:30 right on time. He always did, suit jacket over his arm, coffee cup in hand, eyes already somewhere else. He didn't look toward my car. He didn't look toward the street. He just pulled out of the driveway and drove off like any other weekday. Linda stayed behind. That was also new. She usually ran errands in the morning, groceries, gym, anything that got her out of the house. Today, she stayed inside. I watched her through the blinds of my car as she moved from room to room, phone pressed to her ear, pacing in small, tight circles. She smiled when she talked. That bothered me more than anything else. I began to take notes that day, nothing elaborate, just times, movements, patterns. I wrote them in a small notebook I kept in the glove compartment, the same kind I'd carried into courtrooms for decades. I wrote because memory lies, but ink doesn't. Linda left the house at 10:42. She was gone for exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes. When she returned, she carried a slim folder tucked under her arm. Not a shopping bag, not groceries, paper. She went straight to the den. By the 3rd day, the pattern was unmistakable. Linda was running the house now, not as a spouse, not even as a caretaker, as a manager. She scheduled calls, she organized documents, she made lists. Mark followed her lead, answering when she looked at him, moving when she nodded. They weren't acting like a couple under stress. They were acting like co-workers under a deadline. I stayed invisible. I didn't call, I didn't text, When Linda called me, I let it go to voicemail, then called back later, sounding tired and vague. I told her the tests were ongoing, that doctors wanted to monitor me overnight, that I might stay longer. She asked the right questions, symptoms, medications. She never asked how I felt. On the fourth night, I changed positions. Instead of watching from my car, I crossed the street and slipped into the empty house opposite mine. It had been on the market for months, vacant, for sale sign still up. I knew the realtor's lockbox code because I'd seen her enter it enough times over the years, and because once you've been trained to notice details, you don't forget them. Inside, the air smelled like dust and stale carpet. The house echoed when I moved. I kept the lights off and stood at the front window, looking out at my own porch, from a distance I'd never imagined standing. That was when I saw the visitor, a man in his 40s, maybe early 50s, clean cut, suit without a tie. He parked neatly, checked his watch, and knocked once. Linda opened the door immediately, like she'd been waiting. They shook hands. Mark appeared a moment later. No greeting, no smiles. They went straight to the den. I raised my phone and took a photo through the glass, my hands steady, my breath slow. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. When the man left, Linda stood on the porch, watching him drive away. She didn't wave. She didn't look relieved. She looked satisfied. That night, I didn't go back to the motel until after midnight. I stayed long enough to see lights move through the house, to see Linda close the curtains in the den, to see Mark pace the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, nodding at things I couldn't hear. I drove back with a clarity that surprised me. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't overprotection. This was preparation. The next morning, Evelyn was waiting for me. She stood on the sidewalk near the vacant house, hands folded neatly in front of her like she'd known exactly when I would come out. She didn't startle when she saw me. She didn't smile. "You saw him," she said. I nodded. That was the lawyer, she said, or someone pretending not to be. "How do you know?" "Because he's been here before. Twice. Always during the day. Always when your son was at work." Linda handled everything. I leaned against the doorframe, feeling the weight of the word handled. Evelyn continued, her voice calm, almost clinical. "I worked in accounting for 35 years, she said. "I know what preparation looks like. This isn't a family sorting things out. This is a transaction." I didn't answer. She looked at me carefully. "You're doing the right thing by watching," she said. "Most men your age would already be shouting." I smiled faintly. "I did enough shouting in my career," I said. "It never helped the truth." She nodded once. "They think you're gone," she said. "That makes people careless." That afternoon, I went back to the motel and listened to the voicemails I'd ignored. Linda sounded concerned, soft, controlled, just checking in. "Let me know what the doctors say. We're handling everything here, so don't worry. Handling everything." I closed my eyes and replayed the words until they lost their shape. That night, I went back to the vacant house earlier than usual. Mark didn't come home until after 9. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped as he walked. He paused at the door, phone in hand, hesitated, then went inside. The lights in the den came on. I moved closer to the window, my heart beating slower than it should have, my mind already separating sound from meaning. I couldn't hear words clearly yet, but I could hear tone. Linda's voice was steady, directive. Mark's was quieter, uneven. I caught fragments through the glass. Timing, paperwork, doctor, court. The word court cut through the night like a blade. I stepped back, my legs suddenly unsteady. This was bigger than I'd allowed myself to believe. I returned to the motel before they finished my thoughts, racing ahead of my body, assembling pieces into a shape I didn't want, but couldn't ignore. By the time I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, the conclusion was already there. They weren't planning to help me. They were planning to replace me. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of traffic, thinking about the irony of it all. I'd spent my life protecting the vulnerable, standing between power and those it tried to crush quietly. I'd believed foolishly that my own home was exempt from that kind of calculation. I was wrong. And as the night stretched on, I understood something else with terrifying clarity. They didn't think of themselves as villains. They thought of themselves as efficient. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether I should confront them, and started asking myself how long I could afford to wait before they made the next move. By the fifth day, I stopped thinking of myself as a father on leave and started thinking like a man building a record. I woke early before the sun burned the desert haze off the road and laid everything out on the small desk in the motel room. Notebook, phone, charger, a printed map with times written in the margins. I didn't rush. Rushing makes you sloppy. Sloppy makes you loud. I needed quiet. Linda called at 8:12. I let it ring twice before answering. "Walter," she said, breathy with concern. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," I said. "They're running more tests." She hummed softly, the sound of sympathy without weight. "Did they say when you'd be discharged?" "Not yet." Another pause. Another calculation. "Well, take all the time you need. Your health comes first." I thanked her and ended the call before she could ask more. I drove back toward the house just before 9. Mark's car was gone. Linda's was still in the driveway. I parked farther down the street this time behind a work truck with ladders strapped to the top. No one looks twice at a man sitting in a car if there's something else more obvious to stare at. Linda left the house at 9:37. I wrote it down. She returned at 11:20. Same slim folder. Different color this time. Blue. When she went inside, I crossed the street and slipped into the vacant house again. The silence inside felt heavier than it had before, like the walls were learning secrets faster than I could keep up. I watched. Linda didn't waste time. She went straight to the den, pulled papers from the folder, and spread them across the desk where I used to work. My chair, my lamp, my pens. She moved with confidence, like the room belonged to her now. At 11:50, another car pulled up. This one was newer, black sedan, tinted windows. A woman stepped out, early 50s, hair pulled back tight, briefcase in hand. They didn't shake hands this time. They hugged. My chest tightened. Family doesn't hug lawyers. They disappeared into the den and closed the door. I moved closer to the window, careful not to let my reflection give me away. I took photos when I could, not many, enough to establish presence. Timestamps mattered more than clarity. The meeting lasted over an hour. When the woman left, Linda walked her out, talking animatedly, gesturing with her hands. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I knew that posture. I'd seen it in court dozens of times. The posture of someone who believes the worst part is already behind them. That afternoon, I met Evelyn again. She waited on the sidewalk like before, but this time she didn't pretend it was coincidence. "They're moving faster now," she said. I nodded. "I saw a second visitor today." She pursed her lips. "Woman?" "Yes." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "That would be the attorney. Not the one whose name they'll put on paper, but the one who designs the paper." I looked at her. "You're sure about this?" She met my gaze without flinching. "I've seen this pattern before. My sister lost her house this way. Different city, same script. That hit harder than I expected." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked. "Because people don't like hearing what they don't want to believe," she said, "especially about their children." I couldn't argue with that. Back at the motel, I reviewed everything I had. Times, faces, calls, fragments of overheard words. It still wasn't enough. Suspicion isn't proof. Even a lifetime in law doesn't change that. What I needed was confirmation, not of intent, of execution. It came that evening. Linda called again, her tone lighter than before. "I spoke with the insurance provider today," she said. "They're recommending a few updates while you're being monitored. Just standard stuff. What kind of updates? Medical authorizations, emergency contacts, that sort of thing." I let a beat pass. "And you need my signature?" "Eventually," she said, "but no rush. We can do it when you're back. Or if it's easier, I can bring the papers to Phoenix." That was the mistake. Bring them to Phoenix. She assumed I was still there. I told her I'd think about it and hung up. That night, I didn't go to the vacant house. I stayed in the motel and waited. At 11:43, my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "Everything okay?" I stared at the screen. I typed back slowly. "Just tired. Test tomorrow." He didn't respond. At 12:27, my phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail notification. Linda. Her voice was lower now, less performance. "I forgot to mention," she said. "The attorney might need to verify some things directly. Nothing serious, just procedure." "Procedure?" I listened to the message twice more before deleting it. By morning, my course was clear. I couldn't stop what I couldn't yet prove, but I could slow it down. I could give them confidence. Confidence breeds carelessness. I called Linda before she could call me. "They're keeping me another few days," I said. Something about irregular rhythms. "The doctor wants to be cautious." She reacted instantly. "Another few days." "Yes." A pause, then warmth rushed back into her voice. "Of course. Take care of yourself. We'll handle everything here." That afternoon, I went back to the house earlier than usual. Mark arrived home just after 6. He looked tense, tired. He didn't have the energy to hide it anymore. Linda met him at the door with papers already in hand. I couldn't hear what they said, but I watched their bodies lean together, heads closed the way people do when they're aligning stories. At 7:15, they sat at the dining table with documents spread between them. At 7:29, Mark signed something. I wrote it down. My hands didn't shake. I felt oddly calm, like I had when a jury foreman cleared his throat before reading a verdict. The moment before the truth lands, Evelyn appeared beside me without warning. "You see it now," she said quietly. "Yes." She folded her arms. "They're not just planning. They're acting." I nodded. She hesitated, then said something that surprised me. "You should let them." I turned to her. "Excuse me." "Let them keep going," she said. "The deeper they go, the harder it is for them to pretend they didn't know what they were doing." That night, I barely slept. I lay on the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying images of my son's hand on a pen, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under a weight he had agreed to carry. I thought about the boy he'd been, the man he'd struggled to become, the mistakes I'd helped him recover from. I wondered where exactly he'd decided that I was expendable. By morning, the grief had settled into something steadier. Resolve. I called my doctor and scheduled a real appointment. Not for show, for documentation. I needed records, timelines, independent verification. Then I called an attorney I trusted, someone who owed me nothing but professional honesty. I didn't tell Linda or Mark. I didn't need to. By the time the sun set that evening, I knew something they didn't. They believed they were managing a decline. What they were really doing was constructing a case, and I intended to let them finish it piece by piece, right up until the moment it collapsed under its own weight. I decided to let myself disappear. Not in the dramatic sense. No goodbye calls, no last messages. Just enough silence to convince them that I was tired, distracted, slipping quietly into the role they had already written for me. I knew that role well. I had seen it assigned to defendants and victims alike over the years. The elderly man who means well but can't keep up. The father whose memory softens around the edges. The inconvenient obstacle made manageable by paperwork. I called Linda that morning and sounded weaker than I felt. "The doctor thinks stress might be making things worse," I said. "They want me to rest. No travel. Limited calls." She reacted with practiced concern. "Oh, Walter, that must be so hard for you." I let my voice trail off. "I just don't have the energy for decisions right now." There it was, the opening she'd been waiting for. "Don't worry about anything here," she said quickly. "Mark and I have it under control." After that, I stopped initiating contact. When Linda called, I answered slowly. Sometimes I missed calls on purpose. When Mark texted, I replied hours later with vague reassurances. I kept my responses short, unspecific, easy to interpret as confusion. At the same time, I started building something else entirely. I met with my attorney that afternoon, in a quiet office on the edge of town. No courthouse, no official letterhead on the door. Just a private room and a man who listened without interrupting. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I framed it as risk. He nodded when I explained the living arrangement, the shared access, the opened mail, the documents I had seen but not touched, and the guardianship, he asked calmly. I inhaled. "I believe they're preparing to file." He leaned back in his chair. "Then we need to assume they already have." He outlined my options with precision. Independent medical evaluations, financial freezes, a trust, preemptive declarations. The language was familiar, but hearing it applied to my own life felt surreal. I signed nothing that day. I only authorized preparation. I wanted them to commit first. That evening, I returned to the vacant house earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully set yet, and the windows of my home glowed with an ordinary warmth that felt dishonest now. Linda was on the phone in the den. I recognized the posture immediately. Elbow on the desk, head tilted, listening more than speaking. I couldn't hear words clearly, but I caught enough. Timeline, capacity, physician, court. Mark entered the room while she was still talking. She motioned for him to sit. He did obediently, like a man waiting for instructions. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. At 8:32, Linda ended the call. She turned to Mark and spoke quickly. He rubbed his face with both hands and nodded. At 8:40, Mark left the house alone. He drove straight to a strip mall 5 miles away. I followed at a distance, my headlights 2 cars back invisible in traffic. He parked in front of a small office with frosted windows. The sign read, Family Services Group. I waited. He came out 20 minutes later holding a manila envelope. He didn't look relieved. He looked resigned. I drove back to the motel and sat in the dark for a long time before going inside. That night, I dreamed of my wife. She was standing in the kitchen, back turned, humming softly while she worked. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. She turned and looked at me with sadness, not anger. You should have seen it sooner, she said. I woke before dawn, heart pounding. The next day, Linda called with an update. We spoke to someone who specializes in elder care, she said gently, just to understand options. Options? I responded slowly. Is that necessary? Only if the doctors think you might need support making decisions, she said. It's all precautionary. I let silence hang between us. Walter, she added softer now. This is about protecting you. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, if you think it's best. She exhaled, relieved. Thank you for trusting us. Trust. The word tasted bitter. Over the next 2 days, they accelerated. Mark stopped going into the office. Linda worked from home constantly. The den became command central. Documents came and went. I saw at least 2 different professionals visit. A man with a briefcase, a woman with a tablet. Both stayed less than an hour. Both left looking efficient and unconcerned. No one looked conflicted. On the 3rd evening, I heard Linda say something that finally made me sit down. If we wait too long, the court might question timing. Mark's reply was barely audible. I don't like this. Linda didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We're doing this for him and for us. You said yourself we can't afford another delay. Another delay. I thought of the debts I had helped Mark pay, the business failure I had quietly smoothed over, the trust I had extended without documentation. They were counting those as investments now. That night, I made a choice. I called Linda and told her I was struggling to keep track of things. I can't remember what the doctor said today, I told her. Everything's blurred together. Her voice changed instantly. It grew calmer, slower. That's okay, Walter. You don't need to remember everything. That's why we're here. I asked her to repeat what we'd discussed earlier in the week. She did, carefully simplifying details, adjusting emphasis. I listened and recorded every word. When we hung up, I sat in the motel room holding the phone like it weighed more than it should. They weren't just planning around me. They were rehearsing me. The following morning, Evelyn knocked on my motel door. I hadn't told her where I was staying. That alone told me something. She didn't step inside. She just looked at me with that same sharp calm. They filed this morning, she said. My stomach dropped, but my face stayed still. How do you know? Because a process server came by the house looking for you. Linda told him you were out of town receiving treatment. I nodded slowly. Evelyn studied me. You're not surprised? No. She crossed her arms. You ready? Yes. That afternoon, my attorney confirmed it. Petition for temporary guardianship, emergency basis, allegations of cognitive decline and financial vulnerability. The paperwork was thorough, disturbingly so. They had prepared it well. That evening, I drove back to the vacant house one last time before everything changed. The lights in my home were on, all of them. Linda and Mark sat at the dining table with papers spread wide. The scene looked almost domestic from a distance, like a family planning a future together. I watched my son sign another document. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder, finality. I turned away before they finished, walked back to my car, and drove into the dark without looking back. They believed they had taken control. What they had really done was cross a line that could not be uncrossed. And from that moment on, this was no longer about family. It was about consequences. The papers arrived 2 days later, slipped under the motel door like a quiet accusation. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. White, thick, official. My name typed cleanly across the front, spelled correctly, no hesitation. Inside was the formal notice I already knew was coming. Petition for temporary guardianship. Emergency request. Allegations carefully worded, legally cautious, emotionally devastating. Reading it felt like watching strangers describe my life with misplaced confidence. Cognitive decline, financial vulnerability, recent bereavement, advanced age, reliance on others for daily decision-making. I set the papers down and let my hands rest on my knees. They didn't shake. That surprised me. I'd stood in courtrooms listening to worse accusations than this, but never aimed at me, never signed by my own son. Mark's name was there, Linda's too, petitioners, concerned family members. I read the document twice slowly, the way I used to read indictments before trial, not to feel them, but to understand them. They weren't sloppy. They were careful. That was Linda's influence. Every claim was soft enough to sound reasonable, vague enough to avoid immediate contradiction. No outright lies, just conclusions built on selective truths. I folded the papers back into the envelope and sat there until the afternoon light shifted across the carpet. This was the moment most people panic. I didn't. I called my attorney. He listened without interrupting as I read sections aloud. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "They've built a decent preliminary case," he said. "Decent, not strong. What's the difference? Decent gets you into court. Strong survives scrutiny." I smiled faintly. That was language I understood. He outlined the next steps: response deadline, medical evaluations, financial disclosures, emergency hearing likely within days. He told me what not to do, just as carefully as what to do. Do not confront them. Do not warn them. Do not sign anything they present. And whatever you do, don't break character yet. Character. After we hung up, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were trying to control the narrative by painting me as unreliable, while I was quietly documenting their every move with clarity they couldn't imagine. That evening, Linda called. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Walter, you should have received some paperwork today." "Yes," I said. I did. I braced myself for guilt, for justifications, for a crack in the performance. Instead, she sounded relieved. "Good. I was worried it might upset you if it came as a surprise." I said nothing. She filled the silence smoothly. "This isn't permanent. It's just a safety net. The court wants to make sure you're protected while your health is uncertain." My health. I let a slight tremor enter my voice. I don't remember agreeing to this. There it was. Her tone softened further, the way you speak to someone you believe is already slipping. "That's okay. You don't need to remember everything. That's why we're doing this together." Together. I asked her what would happen next. She explained it slowly, simplifying language, avoiding specifics. Temporary authority, oversight, support. She made it sound like a favor. "And Mark?" I asked. "He's worried about you," she said quickly. "He hates seeing you stressed." I closed my eyes. After the call, I recorded a note for myself. Time, date, exact phrasing, tone. Linda had just confirmed something critical without realizing it. She wasn't acting in response to my confusion. She was assuming it. The next morning, I went to my doctor's office. Not for show, not for strategy, for truth. I asked for a full cognitive evaluation, memory, reasoning, executive function, everything. I answered every question carefully, not trying to impress, not trying to hide, just honest. The doctor looked at me afterward, eyebrows raised. "You're sharper than most of my patients, 20 years younger," he said. I asked him to put that in writing. He did. I drove straight from there to the bank. I met with the branch manager privately, a man I'd known for years. I explained just enough. Family dispute, possible misuse of authority, pending court action. I asked him to flag my accounts. He didn't hesitate. "No transactions without your direct authorization," he said. no exceptions. I thanked him and left with documentation in my pocket. That afternoon, I went back to the vacant house across the street. Linda was pacing in the den again, phone to her ear. Mark sat at the dining table staring at nothing. When she hung up, she spoke sharply. "The hearing's been scheduled." Mark looked up. "When soon?" "How soon?" "Soon enough." He rubbed his face. "What if he fights it?" Linda didn't hesitate. "Then we show the court he can't." That sentence settled deep in my chest. There was no pretense left between them now. No talk of helping. No mention of love. Just outcome. I stepped back from the window, my legs suddenly weak, and sat on the dusty floor of the empty house. For a moment, grief washed over me hard and fast. Not anger, grief, the kind that leaves you hollow. I thought of Mark as a child, the way he used to wait for me by the door when I came home late, asking if I'd caught the bad guys. I thought of the pride in his eyes when he introduced me to friends as his dad. I wondered when that man had decided I was something to manage. The moment passed. Grief has its place. So does resolve. That night, I called Evelyn. "They're confident," she said before I could speak. Too confident. I told her about the filing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you need me, I'll testify." I hadn't asked yet. Why, I said, "Because I've been watching longer than you think," she said, "and because I recognize abuse when I see it, even when it wears a polite face." The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 2 days away. On Thursday, Linda called again. She asked how I was feeling, asked if I'd eaten, asked if I was sleeping. Then she asked the question she'd been building toward. "Would you be willing to let the court appoint someone temporarily?" she said gently. "Just until things settle." I let my voice waver. "I don't know. I get confused sometimes." She seized on it instantly. "That's exactly why this helps." I sighed. "Okay, if that's what you think is best." She thanked me, relief clear in her voice. After we hung up, I sat very still and stared at my phone. They had everything they thought they needed: consent, documentation, momentum. What they didn't know was that every step they took was being mirrored, logged, and prepared for presentation. Friday morning came faster than I expected. I put on a suit for the first time in weeks. Navy, conservative, familiar. I looked at myself in the motel mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Not because he looked old, but because he looked finished with pretending. I arrived at the courthouse early. Linda and Mark arrived together. She held his arm, lightly guiding him. He looked pale, tense. When Mark saw me, his face flickered, just for a second. Shock, guilt, fear. Linda recovered first. "Walter," she said warmly, "you made it." I nodded. I wanted to say something to Mark, anything, but I didn't, not yet. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the petition, listened carefully, asked questions. Linda's attorney spoke smoothly. Reasonable concern, temporary measure, family acting in good faith. Then my attorney stood. He presented the medical evaluation, the bank documentation, the recorded calls, the timeline. The room changed. The judge leaned forward. Linda's smile faltered for the first time. Mark stared at the table. By the time the judge called a recess, the air felt heavier. I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, breathing slowly. This wasn't over, not even close. But something had shifted. They had expected compliance. What they were getting instead was resistance they hadn't planned for. And for the first time since this began, I saw fear flicker behind Linda's eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when a plan starts to crack. The recess lasted longer than it should have. I sat on a hard bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, my back straight, my hands folded loosely in my lap. Old habits. Across from me, Linda paced in short, sharp steps, heels clicking against the tile like punctuation marks she couldn't control. Mark stood near the window, staring out at the parking lot, as if something out there might rescue him from what was unfolding inside. No one spoke. When the bailiff finally called us back in, the air felt different, thicker, less forgiving. The judge returned to the bench and didn't bother with pleasantries. She looked at Linda's attorney first. "I have questions," she said. The tone wasn't hostile. It was worse, curious. She asked about the timeline, when concerns about my cognition had first been raised. Why no independent medical evaluation had been requested before filing. Why financial documents had been accessed prior to court authorization. Linda's attorney answered carefully, but the pauses between questions grew longer. Each answer seemed to invite another sharper inquiry. Then the judge turned to my attorney. "You submitted additional materials during the recess." "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded. "I've reviewed them." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked directly at Linda. The recording was played next. Linda's voice filled the room, calm and instructive, explaining to Mark how to frame concerns, how to emphasize confusion, how to avoid specific statements that could be challenged later. It wasn't illegal on its own. It didn't have to be. It was intention laid bare. I watched Mark as his wife's voice echoed through the courtroom. His shoulders sagged, his jaw tightened. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. When the recording ended, the judge let the silence sit. "Ms. Hayes," she said to Linda, "would you like to explain this conversation?" Linda stood slowly. She smiled. It was the same smile she used at dinner parties. Polite, controlled, empty. "I was trying to guide my husband," she said. "He was overwhelmed. I was trying to help him communicate clearly." The judge raised an eyebrow, by instructing him on how to present evidence of his father's incapacity. Linda's smile tightened. "We were concerned," she said. "Concerned people talk things through." The judge didn't argue. She simply nodded and made a note. Then she called Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn walked to the stand with steady steps, her posture straight, her hands relaxed. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She answered every question with the same quiet precision. Dates, times, observations, who came to the house, who led the conversations, who handled the documents. She never speculated. She never exaggerated. She simply told the truth. When Linda's attorney cross-examined her, trying to paint her as nosy, as mistaken as overly involved, Evelyn didn't rise to it. "I was watching my neighborhood," she said calmly, "and I was watching a woman prepare to take control of a man who hadn't asked for it." That was the moment I saw Linda's composure crack. It wasn't dramatic. No outburst. No raised voice. Just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes. A subtle shift of weight, like someone realizing the floor beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. The judge recessed again shortly after. This time, when we returned, the ruling came quickly. "The request for emergency guardianship is denied," the judge said. "Based on the evidence presented, there is insufficient justification to override Mr. Hayes' autonomy at this time." Linda inhaled sharply. "Furthermore, the court has concerns regarding potential financial exploitation and undue influence. I am referring this matter for further review." Mark closed his eyes. Linda opened her mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "This court is adjourned." That was it. No gavel slam, no speech, just consequences. Outside, the sun felt too bright, too normal. Mark stopped me in the hallway. "Dad," he said quietly. I turned. For a moment I saw the boy he used to be. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the fear of disappointing me. I also saw the man he had become, the one who had signed papers, the one who had stayed silent when silence served him. "I don't have anything to say right now," I told him. Linda appeared beside him, her hand already on his arm. "We were just trying to help," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. "No, you weren't." Her jaw tightened. That was all. I walked away without another word. That afternoon, my attorney and I sat in his office reviewing next steps, civil protections, asset safeguards, documentation. He spoke in the measured cadence of a man who knew this wasn't over. "She'll push back," he said. "People like her don't retreat quietly." I nodded. "I expect she'll escalate." That evening, I returned home for the first time in weeks. The house felt wrong, not empty, occupied, altered. Furniture shifted, files out of place. The den smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't mine or my wife's. I stood in the doorway and let the feeling wash over me. I didn't say anything. Linda was in the kitchen when I walked in. Mark sat at the table staring at his phone. She turned surprised, then recovered quickly. "Walter, you should have told us you were coming back. I set my bag down. I live here." Mark looked up then. "Dad, about today," I held up a hand. "Not tonight. I went to my room and closed the door. Later, long after the house had gone quiet, I stepped into the den. Drawers had been opened, files rearranged, my chair pushed back at an angle I never used. I sat down slowly and opened my old filing cabinet. They hadn't taken everything, just what they thought they needed. I smiled faintly. Arrogance makes people sloppy. Over the next 2 days, I said little. I moved through the house, calmly, deliberately. I let Linda watch me from the corners of her eyes. Let Mark wonder what I was thinking. Behind the scenes, I moved faster. I finalized the trust documents. I transferred ownership of the house into it. I restricted access to accounts. I changed passwords, updated authorizations, closed doors they hadn't realized were still open. On the third night, Linda confronted me. "You can't shut us out," she said, standing in the hallway outside my room. "We're family." I looked at her steadily. "Family doesn't file court papers in secret." She scoffed. "You're overreacting." I shook my head. "No, I'm responding." Mark stood behind her, silent. That silence told me everything. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because the pain was gone. It wasn't, but because the uncertainty was. They had shown me who they were when they thought I wasn't watching. Now they knew I was. And the balance had shifted decisively in ways they were only beginning to understand. The house changed after the ruling, not in ways you could measure, but in how it breathed. Doors closed more softly. Footsteps hesitated outside rooms. Conversations ended the moment I entered a space. Linda stopped pretending I was fragile and started treating me like an obstacle that refused to move. Mark drifted between us, silent and pale, like a man waiting for someone else to decide what he was allowed to feel. I stayed calm on purpose. I made coffee in the mornings and read the paper at the table like I always had. I asked Mark about work. I thanked Linda when she cooked. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't remind them that the court had seen through their story in less than an hour. People like Linda don't fear confrontation. They fear uncertainty. So I gave her plenty of it. 3 days after the hearing, she changed tactics. She cornered me in the kitchen just after lunch when Mark was upstairs and the house was quiet. "Walter," she said, folding her arms, "we need to talk about expectations." I looked at her and waited. "This situation isn't healthy for anyone," she continued. "The tension, the lack of trust. Maybe it would be best if we sat down with a mediator or another attorney, someone neutral. Neutral for whom I asked." She exhaled sharply. "For the family." I nodded slowly. "I'm open to discussions." She relaxed a fraction. "Good, because dragging this out won't benefit anyone." That was the tell. Dragging this out meant something very specific to her. That evening, I heard her on the phone again in the den. She didn't bother closing the door all the way this time. Confidence had returned, thin but persistent. "He's back in the house," she said quietly. "But he's cooperative." "Yes." "No, the trust paperwork isn't finalized yet. We still have time." I stopped at the top of the stairs and listened. She lowered her voice further. "We just need him to sign one thing. After that, it doesn't matter what he thinks he owns." I felt my hands curl into fists. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I waited until she ended the call and left the room. Then I walked into the den and sat at the desk she had used so freely. I opened my drawer. Inside was a folder I didn't recognize, thin, new. I opened it carefully. Draft documents, not filed, not signed. A revised version of authority language carefully worded to appear voluntary. Not guardianship, something quieter, durable power, limited scope, broad effect. I closed the folder and put it back exactly as I found it. That night, I slept with my phone on the nightstand and the recorder on. Linda tried again the next morning. She brought coffee to the table and set it down in front of me like a peace offering. "I spoke to a colleague yesterday," she said casually. "Someone who specializes in estate planning for seniors." I raised my eyes. She smiled. "He mentioned that people in your position often feel more at ease once things are simplified. Delegated? Delegated to whom?" She didn't answer right away. She stirred her coffee slowly. "To people who care about you." I took a sip and nodded. "Maybe I said." "I get tired managing details." Her eyes lit up just a little. "We could start small," she said, "just to take pressure off you." I let my shoulders slump. What would that involve? She explained it carefully, as if speaking to someone who might lose the thread at any moment. I asked her to repeat parts. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. I let my voice waver in just the right places. She took notes. That afternoon, I called my attorney and forwarded the documents I'd photographed earlier. He didn't need long to review them. "She's trying to bypass the court entirely," he said. "That tells me she knows she won't win there. What do you recommend?" "We let her try." I smiled. That evening, Mark finally spoke. He found me in the garage, pretending to sort through old boxes I hadn't touched in years. "Dad," he said quietly. I looked up. "I don't know how things got this far." I waited. "Linda thinks she's helping," he continued. "She's just trying to protect us." Us. I set the box down. "Mark," I said, "do you believe I'm incapable of managing my own life?" He hesitated too long. That answer was enough. Later that night, Linda brought the papers. She knocked on my bedroom door and stepped inside without waiting. "I thought we could look at these together," she said, holding the folder. "No pressure, just information." I gestured for her to sit. She went through each page, slowly pointing out highlights, emphasizing how limited the authority was, how easily reversible everything would be. I listened and nodded. Then I asked, almost as an afterthought, "Would you mind explaining that last section again?" She leaned closer, confident now, and explained the clause that transferred financial decision-making in the event of temporary incapacity. She used the word temporary 3 times. I thanked her and told her I'd think about it. She didn't push. That was new. She believed she'd already won. The next day, Evelyn stopped me outside while I was checking the mail. She looked worried. "She's telling people you agreed," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Agreed to what? That she's helping you transition? That you're stepping back?" I nodded slowly. "Good." Evelyn frowned. "That's good. Yes, it means she's rushing." That night, I called Linda and told her I'd decided to sign. She didn't even try to hide her relief. "That's wonderful," she said. "Truly. I'll bring the final copies tomorrow. Make it easy," I added. "I get overwhelmed." "Of course." I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. The following afternoon, she returned with the papers and a pen already uncapped. Mark hovered in the doorway. Linda set the folder down and smiled. "This just gives us room to breathe," she said. "You won't even notice a difference." I picked up the pen and held it over the page. Then I stopped. "Can you remind me again who drafted this?" I asked. She hesitated for the first time. "A colleague," she said. "Which one?" she named. "A firm." I nodded. "And this gives you authority over my accounts, correct, temporarily. And the trust documents I filed last week," I continued. "How does this interact with those?" Her smile vanished. "What trust documents?" I set the pen down. The room went very still. I stood up and walked to the dresser, opened a drawer, and pulled out copies of the filed trust, the bank restrictions, the medical evaluations. I laid them out on the bed one by one. Linda stared at them, her mouth slightly open. Mark stepped forward. "Dad, what is this?" "This," I said calmly, "is me paying attention." Linda recovered quickly, but not fast enough. "You tricked us," she snapped. I shook my head. "No, I let you talk." She stepped back, anger flashing openly now. "You don't understand what you're doing." I met her gaze. "I understand exactly what I'm doing." She gathered the papers and left the room without another word. Mark stayed behind. He looked at me like a stranger. "Why didn't you tell me you knew?" he asked. I sighed. "Because I needed to know how far you'd go if you thought I didn't." He looked away. That night, the house felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were waiting. Linda didn't speak to me for 2 days. On the 3rd, I received an email from her attorney. Aggressive, accusatory, threatening. I forwarded it to mine. He replied with one line, "Now she's scared." I slept soundly for the first time in months, because I knew something she didn't. She had tried every quiet path, every polite manipulation, every shadowed shortcut. The only place left was open conflict, and in that space, she no longer had the advantage. Not anymore. The morning after the injunction was issued, the house felt like it had finally chosen a side. Linda didn't come downstairs. Mark left early without saying goodbye. I stood alone in the kitchen, the Arizona light spilling across the counter, and realized how quiet victory could be when it arrived without applause. By noon, my phone started ringing. unknown numbers, blocked callers, a few voicemails left without messages, just breathing, and the sound of a line going dead. I didn't return any of them. I already knew who was calling. Instead, I drove to the bank. The manager met me in his office with a folder already open. He spoke carefully, like a man who understood the gravity of paperwork, but also the weight of family. All attempted account actions have been flagged, he said. No transfers, no new loans, no changes without your physical presence and identification. Good, I said. And the credit inquiry? He nodded. We caught it. Someone tried to initiate a home equity process last week. Incomplete. Stopped. I thanked him and left with copies of everything. On the drive home, I pulled into a quiet parking lot and sat there longer than I meant to. The steering wheel felt cold under my hands. This wasn't just about stopping them anymore. It was about understanding how close they'd come. That afternoon, Evelyn called. She had news. Linda met with a private investigator yesterday, she said. The same one she used years ago when she divorced her first husband. I closed my eyes. Evelyn didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The pattern was clear now. Linda didn't fight directly. She built files, narratives, paper trails that made other people do the fighting for her. I went home and locked my study door. I spread everything out on the desk. Timelines, phone records, copies of emails my attorney had subpoenaed. Linda's communications with her lawyer had become more frantic in tone, more careless. And then I saw it. A forwarded message she hadn't meant to share. A draft complaint. Civil. Not guardianship. Something else. Undue influence. She was pivoting. If she couldn't prove I was incapable, she would try to prove I had been manipulated. By whom she hadn't decided yet. The implication would be enough. I leaned back in my chair and laughed once, sharp and humorless. She was accusing me of the very thing she had been doing. That evening, Mark knocked on my study door. He looked exhausted, unshaven. His shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and gestured to the chair across from me. He sat and stared at his hands. "She's planning to leave," he said finally. I said nothing. She's been packing things, quietly, cash withdrawals. She thinks once this blows up, she can say I turned you against her, that she tried to help and was pushed out. I watched him carefully. "And what do you think I asked?" He swallowed. "I think she's always been like this. I just didn't want to see it." I leaned forward. "Mark, tell me something honestly. When she talked about my health, my memory, did you believe her?" He hesitated. "Sometimes. That hurt more than I expected, but I didn't show it. She told me you were afraid of being alone," he continued. "That you'd cling to anything familiar. That she was protecting all of us." "Protecting herself," I said. He nodded slowly. "I should have stopped it sooner." "Yes, you should have." The silence that followed was heavy, but necessary. "She's filing tomorrow," he said. "Her lawyer thinks she still has a shot." I smiled faintly. "Does he know about the audio recordings?" Mark's eyes widened. "What recordings?" I stood and opened the safe behind the bookshelf. I pulled out a flash drive and set it on the desk. Everything she said when she thought no one was listening. Instructions, timelines, intent. Mark stared at it like it might explode. "She told me there was nothing like that," he whispered. "Of course she did." He stood abruptly. "I need to confront her." I shook my head. "No. Let her walk into court believing her story is intact. Truth works best when it arrives uninvited." The next morning, Linda didn't come home. Her lawyer filed the complaint at 10:30. By noon, my attorney had responded with a motion to dismiss and an attachment list thick enough to break a printer. By 3, the judge had scheduled an emergency hearing. That night, I sat alone in the living room and waited. At 9:42, Linda walked in. She looked calm. Too calm. A practiced expression of wounded dignity. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't move. "You blindsided me," she continued. "You made me look like a criminal. You did that yourself." She scoffed. "You don't understand the narrative here, Walter. Optics matter. You're an old man cutting off his family." I stood. I am a man who noticed his life being dismantled piece by piece. Her eyes hardened. "I tried to help you." "No, you tried to control me." She stepped closer. "Mark chose to believe you," she said. "That won't last. He always needs someone to tell him what to think." That was the moment. I opened the recorder app on my phone and set it on the table. "Say that again," I said. She froze. I smiled. "Court is tomorrow." She turned and walked out without another word. The hearing room was small, quiet, no jury, just a judge who had already read too much. Linda sat at one table with her attorney. Mark sat alone behind them, staring straight ahead. I sat beside mine, my hands steady. Her lawyer spoke first. He painted a picture of concern, of a wife trying to help an aging father figure, of misunderstandings and resentment. Then my attorney stood. He didn't speak long. He played the recordings. Linda's voice filled the room, confident and precise. "He'll sign if we keep it informal. If he resists, we escalate to capacity review. Once the money moves, it doesn't matter what he says." The judge raised a hand. "Enough." Linda stared at the table. The ruling was swift. Complaint dismissed. Assets frozen pending further investigation. Referral to the district attorney for potential elder financial abuse. Linda stood abruptly. "This isn't over," she said. The judge looked at her. "For you, it might be." Outside, Mark caught up to me. "I'm sorry," he said. I nodded. "That's a start." She left that night, a single suitcase, no goodbye. 2 weeks later, the charges were formal. I changed the locks the same day. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt earned. I sat on the back porch one evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. I thought about the man I had been when this started, trusting, tired, willing to believe love was enough protection. It wasn't, but attention was, and resolve. I went inside and turned off the lights one by one the way I always had. Tomorrow there would be more paperwork, more calls, more healing. But tonight, the house was mine. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without listening for footsteps. The first letter from the district attorney arrived on a Monday, thick paper official seal my name, typed without honorifics. It felt strange seeing myself addressed not as a former prosecutor or a witness, but as a victim. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and let it sit there while I made coffee. Old habits die slowly. I didn't open anything important until my hands were steady. When I finally read it, there were no surprises. Investigation opened. Preliminary findings supported allegations of elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, and conspiracy. More interviews to follow. Linda's name appeared repeatedly. Mark's appeared too, though always with qualifiers. Alleged, potential, complicit. The law, even when it moves in your favor, never rushes. Mark called that afternoon. I let it ring twice before answering. "Dad." I waited. "They want to talk to me," he said. "The investigators. I assumed they would." He exhaled shakily. I told them I'd cooperate. "Good." There was a pause. "They asked if you'd testify against me." I leaned against the counter, the cool surface grounding me. I said I would tell the truth. Another pause, longer this time. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "Yes, you do." After we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen and stared at the spot where Linda used to stand every morning, fussing with supplements, asking if I'd taken my pills, reminding me to drink water like I was a child who couldn't manage his own body. Concern, when weaponized, leaves a different kind of bruise. The next weeks unfolded in a rhythm I knew well from the other side of the courtroom. Interviews, statements, requests for documentation. I gave everything willingly. Bank records, emails, audio files, timelines I'd annotated in my own hand. Years ago, I would have admired the neatness of the case. Now I felt only fatigue. Evelyn came by one afternoon with a folder of her own. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting it gently on the table. Inside were copies of public records from California, Linda's prior civil judgments, a dissolved LLC, a restraining order filed by a former business partner. "She never stays once the ground gets unstable," Evelyn said. "She extracts what she can and disappears." I nodded. This time she waited too long. The investigators interviewed Evelyn the following week. They took her seriously. They always do when someone keeps notes. Mark moved out of the house before the end of the month. He packed quietly. No dramatics, no speeches. When he left, he stood by the door for a moment like he expected me to stop him. I didn't. Later that night, I walked through the guest room he'd used as an office. The desk was bare, The walls clean. Only the faint outline of a framed diploma remained a rectangle slightly lighter than the rest of the paint. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something settle inside me. This was no longer unfolding. It had unfolded. What remained was consequence. Linda tried once more. A letter handwritten slid under the door like a peace offering. She wrote about misunderstandings, about pressure, about fear. She wrote that Mark had exaggerated things, that lawyers twisted words, that she never meant harm. She wrote that she loved me. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the shredder. The sound it made was satisfying, in a way I hadn't expected. The arraignment was scheduled for early fall. I attended not as a witness, but as an observer. Sitting in the gallery instead of at counsel's table felt oddly disorienting, like watching a familiar play from a different seat. Linda stood straighter than I expected. She wore a conservative suit, hair pulled back, eyes carefully neutral. She did not look at me. Mark did. Our eyes met briefly, and he looked away. The charges were read. Linda's attorney entered a plea of not guilty. Mark's attorney requested separate consideration. The judge set dates and warned everyone about contact restrictions. When it was over, I stood slowly, my joints complaining, and walked out without turning back. Outside, the air smelled like dust and heat and approaching rain. Evelyn waited near the steps. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I am, and I meant it." In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. People started calling, friends of friends, neighbors of neighbors, older couples I barely knew. Word travels fast in quiet communities, especially when it involves family betrayal in courtrooms. They ask questions about paperwork, about powers of attorney, about how to protect themselves. At first, I answered politely and briefly. Then more calls came. One afternoon, a man named Charles sat across from me at my dining table, hands shaking slightly as he explained how his granddaughter handled his finances. I listened. I recognized the same early warning signs, the same language of concern, masking control. I told him what to look for, what to document, who to call. When he left, he shook my hand with both of his. No one ever explained this to me before he said. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of a sense I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. I contacted a legal aid organization in Phoenix, offered my time, quietly. No announcements. They welcomed me with cautious gratitude. Within a month, I was volunteering twice a week, reviewing cases, advising seniors on estate planning, sitting in rooms filled with the soft hum of fear and relief. I never mentioned Linda. I never mentioned Mark. I didn't need to. The trial date was set for winter. Linda accepted a plea deal 2 weeks before jury selection, reduced charges in exchange for restitution, and a ban from fiduciary roles. No jail time, probation, mandatory counseling. Mark's case proceeded separately. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Mark looked at me. I stood. "Your Honor." I said, my voice steady. I raised my son to value honesty and accountability. He failed me, but he did not orchestrate this alone. I paused. I asked the court to sentence him in a way that allows him to rebuild, not hide. The judge nodded. Mark was sentenced to community service and mandatory financial ethics counseling. No prison, a permanent record. As we left the courtroom, Mark approached me. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I know. But I hope someday." I raised a hand gently. "Hope is fine," I said. "Expectation is not." He nodded and walked away. The house felt different after that, not empty, honest. I repainted the guest room, turned it into a small office, bought a new desk, one that faced the window instead of the wall. On a quiet evening in early spring, I sat there watching the sun lower itself behind the trees, long shadows stretching across the lawn. I thought about the man I had been at the beginning of all this, willing to believe that love alone was enough to keep you safe. It isn't. But clarity is. Boundaries are. Attention is. I opened my notebook and wrote down a list of topics for a workshop the legal aid group wanted me to lead. Protecting your home, understanding powers of attorney, red flags in family financial arrangements. I smiled faintly. Some lessons come late, but they don't have to end with you. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and walked through the house, one room at a time, checking locks out of habit, not fear. When I reached the front door, I paused. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't bracing myself for what might happen next. I was choosing what would. Winter settled in quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself with snowstorms, but with shorter days and a cold that seeps into the bones when you stand still too long. I noticed it first in the mornings, when the house took longer to warm, and the silence felt heavier than before. Not lonely, just honest. There is a difference, but it takes a while to learn it. The trial was over, but the consequences were still unfolding. Linda vanished the way Evelyn said she would. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just a probation officer, a restitution schedule, and a file number that would follow her wherever she tried to start again. She didn't reach out. I didn't expect her to. Mark sent one letter. It arrived 3 weeks after sentencing, written on plain paper, the handwriting uneven, like he'd stopped and started more than once. He wrote about accountability, about therapy, about trying to understand how he'd let someone else think for him. He wrote that he was working nights, saving money, staying away from anything that felt like shortcuts. He wrote that he didn't ask for forgiveness. That part at least was honest. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed. Just where things go when you're not ready to decide what they mean. The legal aid clinic asked me to speak at a community center the following month. Nothing formal, a conversation, coffee and folding chairs in a room full of people who had lived long enough to know how quickly trust could become leverage. I stood at the front of the room and looked out at faces older than mine and some younger, all of them attentive in a way juries rarely are. These people weren't deciding someone else's fate. They were protecting their own. I didn't tell my story directly. I talked about patterns, about how financial abuse rarely starts with threats. It starts with concern, with help, with someone offering to take something off your plate. I talked about documents that sound harmless, powers of attorney, joint accounts, beneficiary changes that seem temporary. I watched heads nod. Afterward, people stayed. They asked questions quietly, like secrets shared at a kitchen table. I answered each one carefully, never rushing, never assuming. When I left, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Evelyn was waiting by my car. "You did good in there," she said. I smiled. "You helped me get here." She waved it off. "I just noticed things early. You did the hard part." Driving home, I thought about that. The hard part hadn't been the evidence or the courtroom or the confrontation. The hard part had been admitting that love doesn't excuse damage, that intentions don't erase outcomes. At home, I poured a drink and stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. For a moment, I let myself grieve, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet acknowledgement of the future I thought I had. Sunday dinners, holidays that meant something, a son who would someday sit across from me and tell his own children about their grandfather with pride. That future was gone, but not everything was lost. I thought about the people I'd met at the clinic, about Charles, about the woman who cried when she realized she wasn't paranoid, just late in noticing, about the relief that comes when someone finally says, "You're not wrong to protect yourself." I slept better that night than I had in months. A week later, Mark showed up unannounced. I saw his car from the window and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the old instinct to prepare for impact. He knocked once and waited. When I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, internally. "I won't come in if you don't want me to," he said. I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many ordinary meals had quietly carried extraordinary betrayal. I made coffee. We sat without speaking for a while. "I'm moving to Flagstaff," he said finally. "New job, clean start. That's probably wise." He nodded. "I'm not asking for anything, Dad. I just wanted you to hear it from me." I looked at him then, really looked. "Mark, I said you don't get to rebuild by pretending this never happened. You rebuild by carrying it honestly." "I know." Silence again. He stood. "I won't contact you unless you say it's okay." I considered that. "You can write," I said. "I may not always respond." "That's fair." At the door, he hesitated. "I should have protected you," he said. "Yes, you should have." He left without another word. I locked the door and stood there for a moment, my hand still on the knob, breathing through the ache that followed. Some closures are not endings, they are boundaries. Spring came early that year. The yard needed attention, and I welcomed the work. There is something grounding about pulling weeds and trimming hedges, about putting your hands in the dirt and seeing immediate, honest results. One afternoon, as I was clearing out the shed, I found a box of old files, court transcripts, notes from cases long closed. I sat on the floor and flipped through them, recognizing my own handwriting from decades ago. I had always believed justice was something you pursued outward, that it lived in statutes and arguments and verdicts. Now I understood it differently. Justice also lives in refusal, in saying no when silence would be easier, in choosing clarity over comfort. I sorted the files into 3 piles: keep, donate, shred. The shredder hummed steadily for over an hour. That evening, I sat at my desk in the converted guest room and opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote a simple heading: What I know now. I began listing things. Pay attention when concern feels rehearsed. Never sign anything you don't fully understand, no matter who asks. Love is not diminished by boundaries. Family does not get a discount on harm. I closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the house settle around me. The quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. Later, I received an email from the legal aid director. They wanted to expand the program: workshops, one-on-one consultations, a small task force focused on elder protection. They asked if I would help lead it. I typed my response without hesitation. Yes. When I turned off the light that night, I walked through the house as I always did, checking locks, touching door frames, a ritual that had become habit long before fear gave it meaning. At the front door, I paused. This house had seen loyalty and betrayal, certainty and doubt, loss and resolve. It had held my life together while parts of it fell apart. I rested my hand against the door, feeling the solid wood beneath my palm. Some people measure success by what they accumulate, others by what they keep. I had kept my home, my dignity, my clarity, and that I knew now was enough. Upstairs, the house creaked softly as it cooled, an old sound, familiar and unthreatening. I turned off the last light and went to bed, not wondering what the next day might take from me, but quietly certain of what it would not. The morning light came in soft and low, touching the edges of the room without asking permission. I woke before the alarm, the way I had been doing lately, not out of anxiety but out of habit. When you spend a lifetime anticipating the next move, your body remembers even after the danger has passed. I lay there for a while, listening to the house breathe, pipes clicking as they warmed, a distant car starting somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds, honest sounds. That was how I knew this chapter was ending. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had once been a battlefield of glances and half-truths. It looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because I had. The trust documents were finalized the week before. The house was protected in a way that did not depend on anyone's promises. The accounts were clean, the permissions clear, no loopholes left for charm or manipulation to crawl through. I signed the last page with a steady hand. When I sealed the envelope, I felt something release inside me. Not relief exactly, resolution. Later that morning, I drove to the community center. The room was fuller than the last time. Word had spread. Not my story, not the scandal, but the usefulness of what we were doing. People came carrying folders, questions, and a quiet urgency that only comes when you realize time matters more than comfort. I stood at the front again, but this time I didn't feel like I was standing alone. I talked about preparation, about dignity, about how protecting yourself is not an act of suspicion, but of respect for the life you have already lived. I told them something I hadn't said before, that betrayal often feels personal, but it follows patterns, and patterns can be broken once you learn to see them. I watched faces soften, shoulders relax. Afterward, a woman approached me, older than me by a few years, sharp eyes, calm voice. I thought it was just me, she said. I thought I was being difficult. You weren't, I said. You were paying attention. She smiled, like someone who had just been given permission to trust herself again. That afternoon, I went home and opened the garage. I pulled out boxes I hadn't touched since my wife died. Old tools, holiday decorations, a stack of photo albums I had been avoiding. I carried them into the living room, one by one. Grief doesn't ask for permission either. It waits until you stop running. I sat on the floor and opened the first album. There we were, younger, laughing. Mark as a boy, missing teeth, standing between us like the center of gravity. I felt the familiar ache, but it didn't knock the breath out of me this time. Loss changes shape over time, if you let it. I kept what mattered. I put the rest away. In the evening, Evelyn stopped by with a loaf of bread, and no explanation. "You look lighter," she said, handing it to me. "I feel steadier," I said. "That's better," she replied. We sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the neighborhood settle into itself. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Not backing down, I mean." I considered that. "No," I said. "I regret the time I almost did." She nodded once, satisfied. After she left, I walked through the house slowly. The guest room was now my office. The walls held shelves instead of silence. The desk faced the window, and I kept it that way on purpose. I liked being reminded that life continued outside whatever I was working on. In the hallway, I paused at the spot where Mark had once stood, asking for another chance. I didn't feel anger anymore, just clarity. I wished him well in the way you wish someone well from a distance, without reopening the door you worked so hard to close. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams. No rehearsals, just rest. The next weeks were uneventful, and that was the point. Paperwork, meetings, conversations that ended with thank you instead of tension. I settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than imposed. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Mark. Shorter this time, simpler. He wrote that he was staying in counseling, that he was learning to recognize when he let others define his choices, that he didn't expect a response. I read it once, then placed it in the same drawer as the first letter. Some things don't need answers right away. On a quiet Sunday morning, I stood in the kitchen making breakfast for one and realized something unexpected. I wasn't lonely. I was alone. Yes, but alone is a state. Lonely is a story you tell yourself when you think you were supposed to have something different. I had what I needed: agency, safety, purpose. That afternoon, I drafted a short guide for the clinic. Simple language, clear steps, no legal jargon. Something a person could read at a kitchen table and understand without feeling overwhelmed. When I finished, I leaned back and looked around the room. This house had seen me at my weakest and my most resolute. It had held secrets and then released them. It had not protected me. I had protected myself within it. That distinction mattered. As the sun dipped low, I locked the doors, not because I was afraid, but because that is what you do when you care for something that is yours. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window watching the lights come on down the street. Life was not louder now. It was clearer. I thought about the people who would hear this story, about the ones sitting quietly somewhere, wondering if the discomfort they feel at their own table means something. It does. Pay attention to that feeling. Respect it. Act on it before someone else does. Not every betrayal announces itself with cruelty. Some arrive wearing concern and patience. But awareness is stronger than manipulation, and dignity is stronger than guilt. I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, my steps unhurried. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks, its own conversations, its own quiet victories. But tonight, the house was calm, and so was I. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something familiar, or gave you words for a feeling you couldn't quite name, take a moment to let me know in the comments. Share where you're listening from and what part stayed with you. And if you want to hear more stories about Justice Family and the strength it takes to protect yourself when it matters most, stay with this channel, subscribe, and keep listening. Some lessons come late in life, but they're worth hearing, especially when they remind you that it's never too late to choose clarity over silence.